Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. This is Salim Akhtar Malik, your host at the Observation Post channel. On this channel, I talk to you about issues of national and international importance, defense and security matters, as well as important events from military history. You can interact with me on my channel by giving your views and comments, and you can also connect with me on Twitter where my address is at Salim Akhtar 53. Your views are comment your views and comments are important to me because they help me in fine-tuning my talks which I deliver to you from time to time on the Observation Post channel. In this session, I'll be talking to you about the prospects of peace in Afghanistan in the wake of the US-led coalition forces withdrawal from this country. We know that the US led coalition forces fighting in Afghanistan since more than a decade are in the process of winding up their operations with a view to leaving this country. Presently, they are destroying the equipment which cannot be carried along while they withdraw, and the advanced elements, that is, the advanced parties of the withdrawing forces have already left Afghanistan or in the process of leaving. And they say that at the best, by the end of this month, that is by the end of May 2021, all the forces will vacate Afghanistan, that is, they will withdraw from it. So while we talk about the prospect of peace in Afghanistan after these forces withdraw, after the foreign forces withdraw from this country, we have to keep in mind that the peace in this country, that is Afghanistan, cannot be achieved in isolation. Afghanistan does not exist in a vacuum, and whatever happens around Afghanistan also impacts upon the events inside it. So while probing into the prospects of peace in Afghanistan and in the region around it as a whole, I have formulated 4 questions. All these questions, that is, each one of these questions corresponds to one of the myths, one of the popular myths which are prevalent about Afghanistan since long. I'll try to answer each one of these questions related to, as I said, one of the myths about Afghanistan. And I hope that after I have answered all these questions and discussed those questions in front of you, not only myself, but you will also be clear about whether there will be peace in Afghanistan in the near future or in distant future. If so, what would be the shape of the future, which will be decided by various actors, state as well as non-state, which are participating in determining the fate of this country. Now, these questions which I'm going to ask myself, and I will also throw to you for your probing and for asking to yourselves. The first of these questions is, since how long has Afghanistan been a modern state? When I say modern state, I mean a state which has a central authority, a setup for maintaining law and order inside its territories, and an administration to facilitate the day-to-day working and affairs of its people. So the first question I would restate it, since how long had Afghanistan been a modern state? The second question, which corresponds to the second myth, is about Afghanistan being a graveyard of empires. So my second question is, had Afghanistan actually been the graveyard of foreign empires only? The third question is, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, were they seriously interested in invading Afghanistan? This is a very explosive question because people will start laughing at me. But this is the question, nevertheless. Were the Soviets serious in invading Afghanistan, or were they interested in invading Afghanistan on the Christmas Eve of 1979? And my last question is, how much the peace in Afghanistan is contingent upon its neighbors? So these are the four questions, the answers to which I'll try to find out in order to analyze the situation in the region and to make any forecast about the prospects of peace in Afghanistan and the areas around it. Because as I said, Afghanistan does not exist in a vacuum. When I say Afghanistan does not exist in a vacuum, we look at the geography of this country. We find that Afghanistan is located at the crossroads of Iran, Central Asia, which was till the 1990s part of the Soviet Union, which had been a superpower. So, Iran, Central Asia, with or without Russia, India. Even Indians claim that they have a stake in Afghanistan and that Afghanistan had been part of their empires, ancient empires, or you may call them mythological empires during the times of Ashoka and the Maurya dynasties. Next is China. China also has its borders with Afghanistan. So these countries which border on Afghanistan were heir to ancient civilizations. There was the Persian civilization, there were the Central Asian civilizations, which were reinforced by the bigger Islamic civilization, which seeped into this area from the Arabian Peninsula. during the 7th and 8th centuries. Then there was the ancient Indian civilization and, of course, the Chinese civilization, which is also almost 5,000 years old. So I said that a country cannot exist in isolation. And the first thing upon which the statehood is contingent, that is, statehood of any country, that statehood is dependent upon existence of a central authority inside the country. I had enumerated three things, three factors: existence of a central authority, a sort of setup to execute law and order inside the country, as well as an administration to facilitate the day-to-day business and workings and interactions of the people inhabiting the country. So in that case, till late 18th century, Afghanistan did not have a central authority. And since it did not have a central authority, and because it was and it is still a tribal society, it's a conglomeration of tribal societies and tribal confederacies which had been ruling it since ancient times. So the absence of a central authority had created in Afghanistan a vacuum which was always filled by the outside powers. And they came and invaded this country as a whole or in parts, established their dynasties, ruled this country, and thereafter some of them moved forward into more fertile region of India, where again they established their dynasties. Some of them, particularly those from Central Asia, established their dynasties and ruled India. So it was not invaded only by its neighbors but also by distant civilizations. For example, the ancient Greeks under Alexander the Great, the legendary Alexander the Great who invaded it, who came to invade India through Afghanistan. And they had come into Afghanistan from Iran after invading Iran. So they also had an influence on Afghanistan, and there was a Greek dynasty which ruled for almost 200 years in the northwest of India and in Afghanistan. Then in the recent times, there were the British, who first came as traders in the garb of a trading company called British East India Company, and thereafter gradually, as a result of the stupidity of the local rulers, they gradually came to rule India. And from India, then they spread their tentacles into Afghanistan also. And they fought three wars, which are called the Anglo-British Wars with Afghanistan. I'll talk about it in detail subsequently. So while I'm discussing as to when did the modern Afghan state started emerging, I would like to debunk another myth that all the rulers or most of the rulers of Afghanistan that is, the kings who had been ruling Afghanistan particularly during the Middle Ages, were of Afghan descent or Afghan origin. They were indigenous to Afghanistan, whereas they were not. So we start with the Mahmud of Ghaznavi, who was of Turkish descent. He was a Turk from Central Asia, and his father had invaded Afghanistan and established his dynasty there. Thereafter, Mahmud of Ghaznavi moved into India and had forays, that is, incursions, 17 incursions or raids into India. And he also established his dynasty in the northwest of India. So that was the Ghaznavi dynasty. The Ghaznavis were followed by the Ghoris. Now, Ghoris were also Persianized Tajiks from Tajikistan. They also established their dynasty in India through Afghanistan. That is, they came into India through Afghanistan. Then there were the Khiljis, and Khiljis were followed by Tughlaqs. Both of these dynasties were Turkish dynasties, that is, they were Turkish speaking people from Central Asia who had descended upon Afghanistan and then on to India. And lastly came the Mughals, again from a place called Farghana, which now exists and is located in modern Uzbekistan. So the founder of the Mughal dynasty was Zahiruddin Babur. He first, after having been defeated by his cousins in Farghana, he first conquered Afghanistan, and thereafter from Afghanistan he moved into India, where he established a magnificent dynasty which lasted till 1857. So, cumulatively, all these foreign rulers, that is, Turks from Central Asia, had ruled Afghanistan for a little more than 800 years. So, that was the Afghanistan and Middle Ages. So, when did an indigenous state emerge in Afghanistan? We find that in the beginning of the 18th century, the Hotak dynasty was the first indigenous or local dynasty which declared Afghanistan as an independent state. So then it fizzled out. You see, the borders of ancient countries remained as permeable membranes which contracted and expanded continuously. And since the borders were not demarcated, there were people living on both the sides. This is but natural that along the undemarcated borders, that is, astride the undemarcated borders, the people living in the regions astride the so-called borders or undemarcated borders are always of the same racial stock. So in case of Afghanistan also, the people living on both sides of its borders, undemarcated borders with its neighbors, were of the same racial stock. So this is a fact that Afghanistan's boundaries or borders with its neighbors were not demarcated until the 19th century. And those were demarcated by the foreign powers because there was no effective central authority in Afghanistan, even in the 18th and 19th centuries. So the Hotaks had established the first indigenous Afghan dynasty, and thereafter it was Ahmad Shah Abdali who had been a chieftain in the army of Nadir Shah Durrani. Now, Nadir Shah was the king of Iran, and Nadir Shah had established his rule in Iran as well as in Afghanistan by conquering it. So, Ahmad Shah Abdali was a chieftain, as I said, of the Nadir Shah's realm, and in the late 18th century, he declared himself independent and he declared Afghanistan, that is the southern part of Afghanistan, as an independent state with its capital at Kandahar. I may make a correction here. Nadir Shah was not Durrani. He was not from Durrani dynasty. Ahmad Shah Abdali was Durrani, and he had established the Durrani dynasty in Afghanistan. He used to call himself Durre Durran, that is pearl of the pearls. So that was one correction. So suffice it to say that the so-called Afghan rulers who had been coming into India from Afghanistan were not of Afghan descent. They were from Central Asia and they were Turkish speaking. They spoke Turkish language and they penned down their biographies also and other records in Turkish language. For example, Zahiruddin Babar wrote his biography, that is his autobiography, titled Tuzke Babri in Turkish language. Tuzke Babri is in Turkish language. We now come to the second myth. Was Afghanistan or had Afghanistan been a graveyard of empires? Now, if Afghanistan had been a graveyard of empires, it had been a graveyard for both the foreign powers which invaded it as well as for the local Afghans. So, this happened when the invaders from Central Asia, Iran, and even distant ancient Greek invaded Afghanistan, they also looted and plundered and killed Afghanis. Well, they also suffered losses. So it was both the ways. We focus now on the recent invasions which were carried out, or the wars which were fought by another foreign power, that is the British, who had come to India and thereafter, after having arrived in India as traders, they gradually usurped power and became the rulers of India. And till the middle of the 19th century, India was ruled by the East India Company. Thereafter, in 1857, when there was what we call the War of Independence, and the British call it the Indian Sepoy Mutiny, they abolished the Mughal Empire and exiled the last Mughal ruler, Bahadur Shah Zafar, into exile in what is now Myanmar. So the British East India Company fought the first Anglo-Afghan War in the first half or during the first half of the 19th century. And this happened between 1839 and 1842. You see, for 3 years. So they had interceded in a struggle for the throne of Kabul by the two local rulers, Shah Shuja and Dost Muhammad. And after invading the country, during which one of the contenders, Dost Muhammad, had fled to India. They left Afghanistan, that is the British East India Company, left Afghanistan and went back to India. While they were going back, their expeditionary force, which comprised 4,500 all ranks, including the British troops as well as the local troops, there is the Indian troops, native Indian troops. So 4,500 all ranks plus 12,000 civilians, most of whom were the camp followers of the expeditionary force, while they were retreating from Afghanistan into India. Because of the bad weather and because of the poor logistics, they were worn out. And adding to that, the Afghans pursuing the expeditionary force attacked it and they destroyed the entire expeditionary force, and there was only one lone survivor. He was Dr. William Braddon. Dr. William Braddon was the assistant surgeon of the British East India Company's expeditionary force which had gone into Afghanistan. Only this person, that is Dr. William Braddon, survived, and he reached Jalalabad on a dying horse. So the British suffered losses, heavy losses, and lost the entire expeditionary force, but then they recoiled with an army of retribution and again laid waste the entire region, that is the whole country of Afghanistan, and completely destroyed parts of Kabul. And there was a lot of bloodshed. And thereafter, they went back. By that time, Dost Muhammad had returned from his exile in India and he was installed as the ruler of Afghanistan in Kabul. So that was the first Afghan war, in which both the sides suffered heavy casualties. And if Afghanistan was a graveyard, it was a graveyard for both the British as well as the Afghans. Then there was a second Afghan war which was fought between 1878 and 1880. That is again for 3 years. And during this war, the British, that is the British ruling India at that time, I forgot to tell you that after the first Afghan war, India came directly under British rule, and the Queen of England became the Queen Empress of India also, as well. And the Queen of England at that time was Queen Victoria. So the Second Afghan War was fought when British had India under its direct rule. And as a result of the Second Afghan War, which the British waged against Afghanistan, they forced the Afghan ruler at that time, who was Abdur Rahman, to sign the Treaty of Gandamak, whereby they demarcated the boundary between India, that is British India and Afghanistan, and annexed some portions of territory which was claimed by Afghanistan, and those territories which were annexed by the British during the Second Afghan War were Quetta, Harnai, Pishin, Zob, Khyber, and Kurram. Now that was natural because, as I said, the border between India and, that is British India and Afghanistan, was a porous border. It was undemarcated, and when the British demarcated, they wanted the important features, that is, the tactically important features dominating the approaches leading into British India from Afghanistan to be dominated by the British. So they included those areas which dominated the major approaches leading into India from Afghanistan by annexing them. So they annexed these areas. And they also got control over the foreign affairs of Afghanistan. So they assumed control of the foreign policy and foreign relations of Afghanistan with other states. Then in the third Afghan war, which was fought during the first half of the 20th century, it was a short war, that is a war for 3 months only, between 6th May 1919 and 8th August 1919. Surprisingly, the third Afghan, that is the third Anglo-Afghan war, was started by the Afghans when Afghanistan attacked British India. And as a result of this war, which lasted, as I said, for 3 months, the British forced the Afghan ruler to sign the treaty accepting Durand Line as the international border between Afghanistan and British India. So, suffice it to say that Afghanistan had been a graveyard both for the empires which had been invading it as well as for the people of Afghanistan. We come to the third question, and that is how much interested the Soviets were in 1979, on the Christmas Eve of 1979 when they invaded Afghanistan. So, there was a monarchy in Afghanistan till 1973 when it was toppled, and Sardar Dawood became the president of Afghanistan. He was toppled and killed on 27th April 1978 as a result of a so-called revolution by a party which called itself People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. And as a result of this revolution, Afghanistan became a one-party state ruled by the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or PDPA, and Nur Muhammad Taraki became the president and prime minister of Afghanistan. And after some time, he was killed, and another ruler assumed power in Afghanistan. And during both these rules, the Afghans, the PDPA had been urging upon the Soviet Union to send its forces into Afghanistan because the people of Afghanistan didn't like the rule by PDPA and they had revolted against it because of the controversial reforms which PDPA had introduced in the conservative society of Afghanistan. And the Soviets had all along been refusing the request by PDPA leaders to send their forces into Afghanistan. But then they had no other choice when the situation became so critical that there was a civil war inside Afghanistan. So then they were forced to send their forces into Afghanistan. So they were an unwilling invader. We come to the last question, and this last question is how much the Afghan peace is contingent upon its neighbors. So you see, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, Pakistan, being at the eye of the storm, had no other alternative or options available but to side with the United States to fight the Soviet occupation because more than 3 million Afghans had migrated from Afghanistan and had sought refuge in Pakistan. So, for more than 1 year, Pakistan had been fighting the Soviets alone, and it was only after more than 1 year when the United States sent its aid trickling in for the fruition of its own strategic objectives, because the United States also had its own axe to grind. However, while the regime of General Ziaul Haq was waging a war, a clandestine or a covert war against the Soviet forces in Afghanistan, it had raised Mujahideen to fight the Soviets, but the Mujahideen were no revolutionary army like the Viet Cong army in Vietnam. Like the Viet Cong resistance movement in Vietnam. At best, they were like prospectors who had descended upon Afghanistan in search of gold. And they could never be equated with a resistance army or a revolutionary force. However, the Peace in Afghanistan has remained elusive, mainly because of the reason of the Afghan infighting. So the Taliban were created, it is alleged that they were created by Pakistan because of the uncertainty created as a result of the infighting between the Afghan politicians and rulers. Thereafter, during the American occupation, in the wake of 9/11, the Americans, it is alleged that they had created ISIS and they had transported ISIS in helicopters. They had helicoptered ISIS fighters from the burning fields of Iraq into Afghanistan to rival the Taliban because they were fighting against the Taliban. So it is again a fine kettle of fish fighting each other. The fact of the matter is that in the present imbroglio, Taliban are the most organized force. And in the wake of the Soviet correction, the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, the vacuum created by the withdrawal of American forces will most likely be filled by the Taliban. This is going to happen whether we like it or not till the Afghan rulers stop fighting with each other and stop leaning on extra regional powers like India to intervene in the internal affairs of Pakistan. Because Indians, as I had stated in one of my earlier videos, they have a vested interest in Afghanistan, and since before independence, they had been claiming Afghanistan or parts of it as part of the ancient Indian empires. So while they will be creating problems by inciting insurgencies and fomenting trouble in Afghanistan as well as in the border areas of Pakistan, Pakistan will respond. Pakistan will not sit idle, and this will be again like sunrise followed by sunset and the sunset followed by a sunrise. It will be a cycle. This is all I wanted to say in this video. See you in my next video with a new topic. Till then, bye bye.